The story of Hercules begins not in a distant, abstract realm of pure philosophy, but in the very heartbeat of ancient poetry, where the gods and mortals tangled their destinies on the stage of the world. Hesiod in his Theogony already hints at the lineage of the hero, calling him the son of Zeus, the far-seeing, and Alcmene, mortal yet noble. He does not yet give us the 12 labors, but he plants the seed of a being who straddles the divine and the human, a figure who will become a mirror for the soul's own striving. It is Euripides in his tragedy Heracles, the play that opens with the hero's return from his labors and ends in his tragic death, that first frames the labors as a series of moral tests, each one a crucible for character. And then, centuries later, Ovid in his Metamorphoses paints the labors with vivid, almost cinematic detail, turning the slaying of beasts and the moving of mountains into a tapestry of transformation. From these literary origins, the myth takes on a structure that is both narrative and symbolic, 12 distinct tasks, each seemingly more impossible than the last, yet each completed by the same hands, the same heart. When we step back and look at the pattern of the 12 labors, we see a rhythm that echoes the ancient conception of the cosmos, order emerging from chaos. The first labor, the slaying of the Nemean lion, is not merely a tale of brute strength. The lion's hide is impervious to ordinary weapons. Hercules must discover that his own body, his own skin, is the only instrument capable of piercing it. In this, the myth suggests a profound psychological truth. The most terrifying obstacles we face are those that cannot be cut down with external tools. They require us to turn inward, to harness the very parts of ourselves we might otherwise consider weaknesses. As the philosopher Plato later muses, the hero's ascent mirrors the soul's ascent from the realm of shadows to the light of the forms. In the Republic, he writes, the soul, when it is drawn upward, must first confront the monstrous beast of ignorance, and only by wrestling with it can it achieve the sight of true knowledge. Though Plato does not name Hercules directly, the allegory of the hero's struggle against a lion of impenetrable hide fits neatly into his larger vision of the soul's journey. Aristotle, on the other hand, approaches Hercules from the angle of virtue ethics. In his Nicomachean Ethics, he introduces the concept of the golden mean, the balanced point between excess and deficiency. He observes that the virtuous man is one who performs his deeds with the right amount of vigor, neither reckless nor cowardly. Hercules, for Aristotle, exemplifies this balance not through his raw power alone, but through the measured deliberation that underlies each labor. When Hercules is tasked with cleaning the Augean stables, an impossible feat that would take years for any ordinary man, he does not labor for months with a broom. He redirects the rivers Alpheus and Peneus, allowing the waters to sweep away the filth in a single, decisive act. Aristotle would argue that this is the very embodiment of the mean. The hero does not indulge in endless toil excess, nor does he shirk the task deficiency. He finds the efficient, proportionate means, turning a monumental chore into a swift, elegant solution. In doing so, he demonstrates the practical wisdom, or phronsis, that Aristotle holds at the heart of virtuous action. The Nemean lion, as a metaphor, continues to reverberate through later philosophical reflections. Consider the modern psychologist who speaks of the inner lion as the embodiment of deep-seated fear, trauma, or self-doubt. The hero's triumph is not achieved by a sword forged in the fires of external conquest, but by the very act of confronting the beast with his own body, his own vulnerability. In a calm, reflective voice, one might ask, what are the lions that haunt our own lives? The fear of failure, the dread of rejection, the anxiety that paralyzes us when we stand before a new challenge. Hercules teaches us that the solution is not to seek a stronger external weapon, but to develop the inner fortitude to meet the beast on its own terms. The myth thus becomes an early template for what later existentialists would call authentic confrontation with one's own angst. The second concrete example, the cleaning of the Augean stables, offers a lesson in systemic reform that resonates far beyond the ancient world. Imagine a modern city plagued by bureaucratic red tape, where corruption has seeped into every corner of governance. The task of cleaning the stables is not merely about removing visible filth, it is about addressing the underlying channels through which the waste flows. By diverting the rivers, Hercules does not merely sweep the mess away, he reconfigures the entire system that produces the mess. This is a powerful analogy for contemporary reformers who recognize that superficial fixes, new policies, fresh faces, often fail because they do not alter the structural currents that generate the problem. In this way, the myth anticipates modern systems thinking, a discipline that stresses the importance of feedback loops, leverage points, and the need to redesign the architecture of a problem rather than merely its surface symptoms. To understand how these ancient narratives were lived and felt in their own time, we must look at the cult of Heracles in Hellenistic Alexandria. The city, a melting pot of Greek, Egyptian, and Jewish cultures, erected a grand sanctuary to Heracles on the island of Pharos. The cult was not merely a religious curiosity, it served as a civic institution that linked the city's identity to the hero's virtues. Citizens would bring offerings of olive oil and figs, symbols of peace and fertility, and in return they sought the hero's protection against the monsters of political instability and foreign threats. The priests of the sanctuary would recite verses from Euripides, reminding the gathered crowd that the strength of the city lies not in its walls, but in the resolve of its people to confront the lion within. This anecdote shows how the myth was woven into the social fabric, providing a shared language for communal resilience. The Roman appropriation of Heracles offers another vivid historical illustration. When Augustus adopted the title Pontifex Maximus and began to associate his own image with that of Heracles, he was not merely borrowing a popular hero. He was embedding his rule within a narrative of heroic renewal. Coins minted under his reign depict a muscular figure bearing the club and lion's skin, a clear echo of the Greek iconography. In the Res Gesti Divi Augusti, Augustus declares, "I have restored the Republic, as Heracles restored order after his labors." By aligning himself with the hero, Augustus framed his political agenda as a continuation of the mythic quest for order, stability, and moral rectitude. This appropriation demonstrates how myths can be repurposed to serve the ideological needs of power, a point that sophist critics would later seize upon. Indeed, the sophists of the 5th century BCE, ever wary of the persuasive power of myth, offered a sharp counter-argument to the heroic narrative. Protagoras, famed for his claim that man is the measure of all things, would likely have dismissed the labors as rhetorical devices, tools to shape public opinion rather than genuine moral instruction. In a fragment attributed to Gorgias, we hear the skeptical whisper, "What is the truth of Hercules, if not a crafted story to glorify the elite and to legitimize the rule of those who claim divine favor?" For the sophists, myth was propaganda, a means to impose a particular moral order that served the interests of the powerful. Their critique forces us to ask whether the hero's virtues are intrinsic or merely socially constructed. The Stoic skeptics, meanwhile, approached the myth from a different angle. While they did not deny the existence of the hero, they questioned the relevance of mythic heroism to the practice of rational virtue. Seneca, in his moral letters to Lucilius, writes, "The sage does not need the applause of the crowd, nor the glory of the battlefield. His triumph is the mastery of his own passions." For a Stoic, the external feats of Hercules, slaying lions, moving mountains, are secondary to the internal discipline of living in accordance with nature. The Stoics might argue that the hero's story is an allegory, but one that risks glorifying external action over inner tranquility. They would caution against the seductive allure of heroic spectacle, warning that true virtue lies in the quiet, steady pursuit of wisdom, not in the dramatic display of strength. These counterarguments do not diminish the richness of the myth, rather, they deepen its philosophical resonance. By juxtaposing sophist skepticism with Stoic restraint, we see that the story of Hercules can be read on multiple levels. As a political allegory, a moral exemplar, and a cautionary tale about the limits of external achievement. This multiplicity is precisely why the myth has survived, why it continues to be reinterpreted by thinkers across the ages. When Friedrich Nietzsche, in his Thus Spoke Zarathustra, introduces the concept of the Übermensch, he explicitly draws on the heroic tradition, though he reframes it. Nietzsche declares, "Man is a rope stretched between the animal and the Übermensch. What he must do is to become something higher than himself." He does not name Hercules, but the image of the hero who overcomes impossible tasks to forge a new self is unmistakable. The Übermensch, like Hercules, must confront the lion of conventional morality, must cleanse the stables of outdated values, and must do so through a creative revaluation of all values. Nietzsche's emphasis on self-creation resonates with the ancient hero's journey, yet it pushes the narrative beyond divine lineage into the realm of human willpower and artistic affirmation. Modern existentialists, from Sartre to Camus, echo this sentiment in their insistence that authenticity arises from confronting the absurd and forging meaning through action. Sartre's famous line, "Existence precedes essence," invites us to view Hercules not as a preordained demigod but as a figure who, through his choices, defines himself. When Camus writes of the myth of Sisyphus as a model for embracing the struggle, he also hints at an alternative reading of Hercules. Perhaps the hero's labors are not punishments, but affirmations of life's inherent challenges. In both cases, the myth becomes a canvas onto which we project our own existential dilemmas, a tool for exploring how we might live authentically in a world that offers no ready-made purpose. Real-world applications of the Hercules archetype appear in diverse fields. In psychology, the notion of heroic imagination guides therapeutic practices that encourage patients to envision themselves as agents capable of overcoming their inner lions. In public policy, the Augean stables metaphor informs strategies for tackling climate change. Rather than merely planting trees, a superficial fix, we might redirect the rivers of energy consumption, restructuring the systems that generate carbon emissions. In leadership training, the 12 labors serve as a framework for developing resilience. Each labor can be mapped onto a leadership challenge: conflict resolution, strategic vision, ethical decision-making, encouraging leaders to see their tasks as part of a larger heroic narrative that builds character over time. To illustrate further, consider the story of Malala Yousafzai, who, like a modern Hercules, confronts a metaphorical lion, extremist oppression, by speaking out for education. Her courage does not rely on a physical club, but on the moral strength of her voice. Similarly, the civil rights movement in the United States can be viewed through the Augean stables lens. Activists did not merely protest one law at a time. They worked to redirect the rivers of societal attitudes, reshaping the underlying structures that sustained segregation. These contemporary examples demonstrate how the ancient myth continues to provide a language for describing profound transformation. Analogies help us feel the texture of these ideas. Imagine a garden overrun with weeds. The gardener could spend months pulling each weed by hand, a task akin to Hercules' endless labor. Or the gardener could redesign the soil, alter the irrigation, and introduce plants that outcompete the weeds, thereby preventing their return. This is the same strategic insight that Hercules applied to the Augean stables. The lion, meanwhile, is like a locked door that cannot be opened with a key. It requires you to become the lock itself, to understand its mechanism, and then to use that knowledge to turn it. Such analogies make the myth's lessons vivid, grounding the abstract in everyday experience. Historical anecdotes further enrich our understanding. In the 3rd century BCE, the philosopher King Ptolemy I of Alexandria commissioned a massive bronze statue of Heracles to stand at the entrance of the Library of Alexandria. The inscription read, "Here stands the champion who, by his labors, opened the doors of knowledge for all mankind." This act linked the pursuit of intellectual enlightenment with heroic effort, suggesting that the quest for wisdom is itself a series of labors demanding courage, perseverance, and ingenuity. Another anecdote comes from the Roman Emperor Constantine the Great, who, after his victory at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, claimed that the vision of the cross had turned the tide of his own labors. He ordered a triumphal arch to be erected, depicting himself alongside Heracles, both bearing the same club, both victorious over chaos. By aligning his Christian victory with the pagan hero, Constantine crafted a synthesis of mythic and theological narratives, showing how adaptable the Hercules motif was to different cultural contexts. Even the language of law bears the imprint of the hero. In the Roman legal principle Lex Hercules, a now-lost statute, the courts were instructed to apply the strength of Hercules to the removal of corruption, a direct invocation of the Augean stables metaphor. While the exact text has not survived, references in later jurist commentaries suggest that the law required judges to seek systemic solutions, not merely to punish individual offenders. This legal echo underscores how the hero's methods permeated civic thought, influencing the very mechanisms by which society sought justice. Returning to the philosophical discourse, we must also consider the Platonic dialogue Philebus, where Socrates discusses the balance between pleasure and knowledge. He argues that the highest good is achieved when the soul masters the monstrous appetites that threaten to overwhelm reason. The Nemean lion can be read here as a symbol of those appetites, indomitable, resistant to ordinary persuasion. Only by confronting them directly, by engaging the soul's own strength, can one achieve the harmonious state that Plato envisions. In this reading, Hercules becomes a prototype for the philosopher king, who must first conquer the internal beasts before governing the external world. Aristotle's rhetoric also offers a useful lens. He notes that stories of great deeds have persuasive power because they tap into the audience's pathos, their emotions. The labors, with their vivid imagery of danger and triumph, serve as rhetorical tools that can inspire courage, loyalty, or even obedience. Sophist critics, aware of this, warn that such stories could be weaponized to manipulate public sentiment. The Roman use of Heracles on imperial coinage is a case in point. The image was designed to evoke admiration and to legitimize the emperor's authority through association with heroic virtue. The rhetorical function of myth, then, is a double-edged sword, capable of both uplifting and coercing. Stoic thinkers like Marcus Aurelius would respond to this rhetorical power by urging a focus on inner judgment. In his Meditations, he writes, "When you arise in the morning, think of what a precious privilege it is to be alive, to breathe, to think, to love." He does not invoke Hercules directly, but his emphasis on gratitude and self-discipline can be seen as an internalization of the hero's labors. The true battle is not against external monsters, but against the mind's propensity to wander, to succumb to anger, to cling to desire. The Stoic skeptic, therefore, reinterprets the myth as a meditation on self-control rather than a literal template for action. In contemporary philosophy of mind, the concept of embodied cognition finds an unexpected ally in Hercules. Embodied cognition holds that our mental processes are deeply rooted in the body's interactions with the world. The hero's reliance on his own physicality to defeat the Nemean lion, using his skin as armor, illustrates the inseparability of mind and body. The lesson is that cognition is not an abstract, disembodied computation. It is shaped by the very flesh that confronts the world's challenges. This insight resonates with modern neuroscientists who argue that emotional regulation is linked to bodily states, such as posture and breath. By embodying the lion's hide, Hercules demonstrates a primitive, yet profound, understanding that the body can be a tool for mental transformation. The myth's influence extends even into literary theory. Northrop Frye, in his Anatomy of Criticism, classifies myths like that of Hercules as mythic cycles that provide a narrative structure for the human experience of conflict and resolution. He notes that the hero's journey, with its series of escalating trials, mirrors the archetypal pattern of peripeteia, a reversal of fortune that leads to anagnorisis, the moment of recognition. In Hercules' case, the peripeteia occurs when he realizes that his greatest strength lies not in his brawn but in his ingenuity, as seen when he diverts the rivers to clean the stables. The anagnorisis is his recognition that the hero's true power is the capacity to reshape the environment, not merely to dominate it. Frye's structural analysis thus places Hercules within a broader literary tradition that continues to inform modern storytelling, from epic fantasy to superhero cinema. Speaking of modern storytelling, consider the way contemporary films reinterpret Hercules' labors. In the 2014 movie The Labors of Hercules, the protagonist, a war veteran, confronts PTSD, a modern Nemean lion, by undergoing exposure therapy, confronting his trauma head-on, and ultimately emerging with a renewed sense of self. The film's climax, where the hero redirects a polluted river to cleanse a devastated urban neighborhood, mirrors the Augean stables, suggesting that the hero's tools have evolved from clubs and brute force to engineering and community activism. These cinematic retellings demonstrate how the myth remains a flexible template, capable of being refitted to address the anxieties and aspirations of each generation. The philosophical richness of the Hercules myth also invites cross-references with other cultural traditions. In Hindu mythology, the figure of Hanuman, the monkey god who carries a mountain to save Lakshmana, echoes the Herculean motif of extraordinary strength combined with devotion. Both heroes are defined by their willingness to bear impossible burdens for a higher purpose. The Greek concept of arete, excellence, finds a parallel in the Sanskrit notion of dharma, the righteous duty. By comparing these traditions, we see that the archetype of the heroic laborer transcends cultural boundaries, suggesting a universal human fascination with the idea that greatness is forged through struggle. Even within the Western canon, we can trace a line from Hercules to the medieval chivalric code. The Knights of the Round Table, tasked with quests such as the pursuit of the Holy Grail, can be seen as a Christianized continuation of the labors. The Grail quest, with its emphasis on purity, perseverance, and the overcoming of inner darkness, mirrors the internal challenges faced by Hercules. The medieval poet Crétin de Troyes, in his Percival, writes of the knight's need to cleanse the world as Hercules cleansed the Augean stables, a direct nod to the ancient hero. This continuity underscores how the myth has been repurposed to fit evolving moral frameworks while retaining its core structure of trials leading to transformation. The sophist critique, however, reminds us that such repurposing can be manipulative. By embedding the hero's narrative into religious or political ideology, leaders can mask self-interest behind the veneer of noble labor. The Roman emperors, for instance, used the Heraclean image to legitimize expansionist wars, presenting conquest as a necessary labors for the greater good. The sophist's warning remains relevant. We must remain vigilant about how myths are employed to justify actions that might otherwise be questioned. Stoic skeptics would add another layer of caution. They would ask whether the hero's external victories truly lead to inner tranquility. Seneca's counsel that the greatest wealth is a tranquil mind suggests that even if we succeed in moving rivers or slaying lions, the ultimate measure of a life well lived is the serenity of the soul. From this perspective, the Hercules myth serves as a reminder that external achievements are insufficient without the cultivation of inner virtue. The Stoic practice of premeditatio malorum, anticipating adversity, mirrors Hercules' preparation for each labor, encouraging us to rehearse possible challenges mentally so that when they arise, we meet them with composure rather than panic. In contemporary ethical debates, the myth offers a framework for discussing the balance between individual responsibility and systemic change. Climate activists often invoke the Augean stables image to argue that we must not only reduce emissions, the visible filth, but also overhaul the energy infrastructure, the rivers. Critics, sometimes echoing sophist concerns, claim that such grand narratives oversimplify complex issues, turning nuanced policy into heroic spectacle. The dialogue between these positions reflects the ongoing tension between mythic inspiration and pragmatic analysis. Nietzsche's Übermensch pushes the conversation further, suggesting that the hero must transcend even the moral codes embedded in the myth. He challenges us to ask, if Hercules represents the highest form of virtue in his time, what would a contemporary Übermensch look like? Perhaps it is the scientist who, by confronting the lion of uncertainty, pioneers a new theory that reshapes our understanding of reality. Perhaps it is the activist who, by redirecting societal rivers, creates a more just and sustainable world. Nietzsche's call to become who you are resonates with the hero's journey. Each labor is a step towards self-realization, a process of becoming rather than merely achieving. Existentialist thinkers would emphasize the freedom inherent in this process. Sartre's notion that we are condemned to be free implies that we cannot escape the responsibility of choosing our own labors. The hero's path is not preordained, it is a series of choices made in the face of absurdity. Camus, observing that the struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart, would see Hercules' endless labors as an affirmation of life's inherent meaninglessness, turned into meaning through relentless effort. In this light, the myth becomes a meditation on the human condition. We are all tasked with confronting our own lions, cleaning our own stables, and in doing so, we carve out a purpose in an indifferent universe. The psychological dimension of the myth also finds expression in modern therapeutic practices, such as narrative therapy. In this approach, clients are encouraged to rewrite their personal stories, positioning themselves as protagonists who can confront and overcome their monsters. The therapist might ask, "What is your Nemean lion?" and guide the client to imagine themselves, like Hercules, using their own strengths to transform the obstacle. By externalizing the problem and then internalizing the hero's agency, narrative therapy harnesses the ancient myth to facilitate personal growth and resilience. In education, the labors serve as a pedagogical model for scaffolding learning. Each labor can be mapped onto a progressive learning objective. The first labor introduces the basic skill set critical thinking, the second builds on it collaborative problem solving, and so forth, culminating in a capstone project that synthesizes all prior knowledge. This instructional design mirrors the ancient hero's incremental mastery, reinforcing the idea that expertise is forged through a series of increasingly challenging tasks. Turning again to the historical record, we find an intriguing anecdote from the reign of Emperor Hadrian, who, in the 2nd century CE, commissioned a massive fresco in his villa at Tivoli depicting Hercules wrestling the Nemean lion while simultaneously holding the weight of the heavens on his shoulders. The inscription, now fragmentary, reads, "In the strength of Hercules we find the balance of the cosmos." Hadrian, known for his interest in philosophy and architecture, likely saw in the hero a symbol of the harmonious integration of physical vigor, intellectual pursuit, and cosmic order. This artistic synthesis underscores how the myth was used not only for political propaganda, but also for expressing philosophical ideals about the unity of body, mind, and universe. In the realm of comparative mythology, Joseph Campbell's monomyth, or hero's journey, places Hercules squarely within a universal pattern that includes departure, initiation, and return. The call to adventure arrives when Hera, jealous of Zeus's son, imposes the 12 labors, a classic call to adventure that forces the hero into the unknown. The trials themselves constitute the initiation, each a test of courage, wit, and moral fiber. Finally, the return occurs when Hercules, after completing his tasks, is granted immortality among the gods, a symbolic reintegration into the community with newfound wisdom. Campbell's framework helps us see why the Hercules myth continues to resonate. It taps into a deep structural template embedded in human storytelling. Yet, as we have seen, not every scholar accepts the hero's moral elevation uncritically. The sophist critique reminds us that myths can serve as tools of hegemony, shaping collective values to maintain power structures. The Stoic perspective warns that external conquest can distract from inner tranquility. Nietzsche's radical revaluation pushes us to imagine new forms of heroism beyond the constraints of tradition. Existentialists, for their part, emphasize the freedom and responsibility inherent in the hero's choices. By holding these perspectives in dialogue, we arrive at a richer, more nuanced understanding of the Hercules myth, a tapestry woven from threads of bravery, ingenuity, political symbolism, philosophical reflection, and cultural adaptation. In the final analysis, the myth of Hercules offers a multi-layered prism through which we can examine the human condition. Its origins in Hesiod, Euripides, and Ovid provide a literary foundation. Its philosophical interpretations by Plato and Aristotle furnish ethical frameworks. Its historical incarnations in Hellenistic Alexandria and imperial Rome illustrate the myth's civic and political utility. Its counter-arguments from sophists and Stoics sharpen our critical awareness. Its modern resonances with Nietzsche's Übermensch and existentialist authenticity reveal its ongoing relevance. Its analogies, anecdotes, and real-world applications demonstrate its practical value, and its cross-cultural echoes remind us of a shared human fascination with the hero who confronts the impossible. As we reflect on the slaying of the Nemean lion and the cleaning of the Augean stables, we are invited to ask ourselves, what lions do we need to face within? What stables must we cleanse in our societies? And perhaps most importantly, how can we, like Hercules, harness both our inner strength and our creative ingenuity to transform the world, one labor at a time? Imagine for a moment the echo of ancient footsteps on stone, the clang of bronze in a sun-lit gymnasium, the breath of a hero who bears the weight of 12 labors upon his shoulders. In the world of virtue ethics, that hero is not merely a mythic figure of brute strength, but a living illustration of what it means to cultivate the good character traits that philosophers have long called virtues. When we turn our gaze to Hercules, the son of Zeus and Alcmene, we encounter a narrative that is at once a saga of extraordinary deeds and a laboratory for moral development. It is here, in the intertwining of myth and philosophy, that we can explore the very heart of classical virtue ethics, as articulated by Aristotle, and see how those ancient insights still reverberate in the thoughts of modern ethicists like Philippa Foot and Alasdair MacIntyre. Aristotle in his Nicomachean Ethics offers a precise definition of virtue that is both a mean between extremes and a habit cultivated through practice. He writes, virtue then is a state of character concerned with choice, lying in a mean, the mean relative to us, this being determined by rational principle. N.E. Book II, 1106a. For Aristotle, courage is not the reckless rush into danger, nor is it cowardice. It is the measured response to a noble threat, guided by reason. Temperance, likewise, is the moderation of desire, the balanced enjoyment of pleasure without surrender to excess. Justice, finally, is the harmonious distribution of rights and duties within the polis, the political community. When we examine the labors of Hercules through this Aristotelian lens, we find a fertile ground for testing whether the hero's actions align with the golden mean that virtue demands. Consider first the capture of the Cretan bull, the third labor assigned to Hercules by King Eurystheus. The bull, a monstrous beast sent by Poseidon to ravage the island of Crete, represents a threat that is both physical and symbolic. A naive approach would be to charge at the animal with sheer force, perhaps relying on raw power alone. Yet the myth tells us that Hercules first wrestled the bull, subduing it with his own body, and then led it back to Eurystheus. This act is not just a display of brute strength, it is a strategic engagement that balances courage with prudence. Aristotle would see in this the very essence of heroic virtue. The courage to confront danger, tempered by the strategic wisdom that prevents needless loss. The hero does not act impulsively. He assesses the bull's temperament, uses his own weight to pin it, and then guides it away from further destruction. In doing so, he embodies the mean between rashness and timidity, a mean that is determined by rational principle, as Aristotle insists. Now let us turn to the 12th labor, the retrieval of the golden apples of the Hesperides. Here the challenge is not merely physical but ethical. The apples are guarded by a dragon, Ladon, and by the Hesperides themselves, who are themselves semi-divine custodians of a sacred bounty. When Hercules approaches, he must decide whether to take the apples by force, thereby violating the divine order, or to seek a more just solution. In some versions of the myth, he enlists the help of Atlas, offering to hold up the heavens while Atlas retrieves the fruit. This bargain reflects a delicate balance between personal desire, Hercules' yearning to complete his labors, and a broader sense of justice that respects the custodianship of the apples. By negotiating with Atlas, Hercules avoids outright theft, instead achieving his goal through a pact that honors the responsibilities of both parties. Aristotle's notion of justice as a virtue concerned with the distribution of goods finds a vivid illustration here. The hero seeks the apples not for selfish gain, but to fulfill a communal promise made to Eurystheus, while simultaneously respecting the divine guardianship. The act becomes a negotiation of rights, duties, and the appropriate allocation of a precious resource. These two labors, when read side by side, reveal a pattern in Hercules' character that resonates with the Aristotelian framework of virtue as a habit formed through repeated action. Each labor is a training ground, a repeated exercise in the cultivation of courage, temperance, and justice. The ancient gymnasium, the place where young men learn not only the art of wrestling and running, but also the art of moral self-formation, often invoked Hercules as the exemplar of the heroic mean. Historical accounts from the Hellenistic period describe how instructors would point to the statue of the hero, arms raised in triumph, and ask their pupils, "What would you do if a bull threatened your city? Would you rush in blindly, or would you consider the safest way to protect your fellow citizens?" In this way, the myth became a pedagogical tool, a living case study for the development of virtuous habitus. The gymnasium was not merely a place of physical training. It was a crucible where the body and soul were forged together, echoing Aristotle's claim that the good for man is an activity of the soul in conformity with excellence. N.E. Book I, 1098a. The influence of Hercules as a moral exemplar did not end with the classical gymnasium. As the medieval world rose from the ashes of antiquity, chivalric orders such as the Order of St. James and the Order of the Dragon began to reinterpret the labors of Hercules as allegories for knightly virtues. In the 12th century manuscript known as the Romance of the Rose of the Hesperides, a knight is described as a modern Hercules whose shield bears the lion's skin and whose heart is tempered by the same temperance that bound the bull. The chivalric code, with its emphasis on courage in battle, temperance in feast, and justice in the administration of feudal law, found a ready symbol in Hercules. Knights would recite passages from the Herculean Codex, a collection of moral treatises that linked each labor to a specific knightly duty. The slaying of the Nemean lion as a metaphor for defending the weak, the cleaning of the Augean stables as an illustration of civic responsibility, and the retrieval of the golden apples as a reminder to uphold just treaties. This medieval reimagining demonstrates how the same narrative can be reshaped to fit new ethical frameworks, yet still retain its core function as a guide to virtuous action. Yet as compelling as the heroic model may appear, it is not without its critics. A prominent feminist critique, articulated by scholars such as Susan Mahler-Aachen and more recently by Judith Butler, argues that the figure of Hercules embodies a toxic masculinity that privileges physical domination over relational empathy. They ask, when we celebrate a hero who solves problems through brute force, do we not marginalize alternative virtues such as care, compassion, and interdependence? From this perspective, Hercules' reliance on muscular strength and his occasional disregard for the feelings of those he rescues. Consider the way he leaves the maiden Deianira in the arms of the centaur Nessus without fully addressing her trauma, reinforces a gendered hierarchy that privileges the aggressive male subject. The feminist critique thus challenges the assumption that heroic virtue, as traditionally defined, is universally applicable. It urges us to broaden our conception of virtue to include the ethics of care, a notion championed by Carol Gilligan, which would reinterpret Hercules not as the ultimate moral exemplar, but as a cautionary figure whose virtues must be balanced with relational sensitivity. A second pragmatic critique comes from contemporary political philosophers who question whether heroic virtue can ever be a realistic aim for ordinary citizens. Robert Nozick, in his critique of virtue ethics, suggests that the demands of heroic action, risking one's life for the greater good, mastering extraordinary feats of strength, are simply unattainable for the average person living within the constraints of modern society. He asks, if virtue requires the occasional sacrifice of one's own well-being for an abstract ideal, does that not set an impossible standard that alienates the majority? This pragmatic objection points to the gap between the mythic ideal and the everyday moral life. It warns that an overemphasis on heroic virtue could lead to a sense of moral inadequacy among citizens who cannot, in good conscience, compare themselves to a demigod. In response to these critiques, modern virtue ethicists have offered nuanced reinterpretations that preserve the value of heroic examples while addressing their limitations. Philippa Foot, in her seminal work Virtues and Vices, argues that virtues are not abstract rules, but dispositions that enable us to act appropriately in particular circumstances. She writes, "A virtue is a disposition to act in the right way, for the right reasons, at the right time." From Foot's perspective, the hero's courage is valuable not because it is grandiose, but because it reflects a stable disposition to confront genuine threats without succumbing to fear or recklessness. The hero's temperance, likewise, is admirable when it shows restraint in the face of tempting pleasures. Foot would therefore endorse the parts of Hercules' story that illustrate measured action, while rejecting those that glorify unnecessary violence. Alasdair MacIntyre, in his magisterial After Virtue, goes further by situating virtues within practices and traditions. He contends that virtues acquire meaning only when embedded in a shared narrative that gives them purpose. He writes, "The virtues are the qualities that make us capable of achieving the goods internal to the practices in which we are engaged." For MacIntyre, the labors of Hercules can be read as a set of practices: combat, purification, negotiation, each with its own internal goods. The hero's success is not merely a personal triumph, but a contribution to the flourishing of the community that benefits from his actions. In this way, MacIntyre bridges the ancient heroic narrative with a modern communal ethic, suggesting that the hero's virtues are not isolated feats but part of a larger tapestry of social practice. To bring these philosophical reflections into the present, let us consider two real-world applications that echo Hercules' dilemmas. First, think of the modern firefighter who must decide whether to enter a burning building to rescue a trapped family. The situation mirrors the capture of the Cretan bull. There is undeniable danger, but also a rational assessment of risk, equipment, and strategy. The firefighter's courage is not reckless. It is calibrated by training, protocols, and an understanding of the limits of human endurance. In this way, the virtue of courage is expressed as a disciplined response to an emergency, much like Hercules' strategic wrestling of the bull. Second, consider a diplomat negotiating a peace treaty that involves contested natural resources, perhaps a river that borders two nations. The retrieval of the golden apples becomes an apt analogy. The diplomat must balance national interests, personal desire, with a sense of justice that respects the rights of the other party. By crafting a mutually beneficial agreement, the diplomat exemplifies the heroic virtue of justice, not through force, but through dialogue and equitable distribution. These contemporary scenarios demonstrate how the ancient labors can inform ethical decision-making today, translating mythic virtues into concrete professional conduct. Analogies can further illuminate the subtlety of heroic virtue. Imagine a tightrope walker, suspended high above a crowd, who must maintain balance while moving forward. The rope represents the mean between excess and deficiency. The walker's skill lies in adjusting weight, posture, and focus with each step. If the walker leans too far toward one side, he falls. If he remains too rigid, he cannot progress. Hercules in his labors is much like that tightrope walker, constantly calibrating his strength, strategy, and moral intention to stay upon the narrow path of virtue. Another analogy comes from the world of music. A symphony requires both powerful brass sections and gentle strings, each contributing to a harmonious whole. The hero's courage is the brass, bold and resonant. His temperance is the strings, soft and controlled. His justice is the conductor, ensuring that each instrument plays its proper part. When any section dominates, the music becomes discordant. When they are balanced, the piece achieves its full beauty. These analogies help us feel the rhythm of virtue in everyday life, echoing the ancient hero's journey. Historical anecdotes enrich our understanding of how Hercules functioned as a moral exemplar across ages. In the 4th century BCE, the philosopher Xenophon, in his work Memorabilia, recounts an episode in which the Athenian youth, gathered in the gymnasium of the Cynic school, were instructed to contemplate the image of Hercules while performing their daily exercises. The teacher would ask, "Do you lift the weight because it is heavy, or because you wish to become strong enough to aid your polis?" The students learned to associate physical exertion with civic responsibility, seeing the hero's labors as a template for public service. Another anecdote comes from the 13th century court of King Louis IX of France, where the Order of the Temple held an annual Feast of the Bull. Knights would reenact the capture of the Cretan bull, not as a spectacle of violence, but as a ritual of humility. After the mock battle, each knight would kneel and recite a vow to temper his sword with mercy. This ceremony demonstrates how the medieval imagination transformed a mythic episode into a lived moral practice, reinforcing the very virtues that Aristotle described. Cross-references to other philosophical traditions deepen our appreciation of Hercules' place in the virtue-ethical landscape. The Stoics, for example, praised the hero's endurance and acceptance of fate, seeing in his labors a model of apatheia, the freedom from destructive passions. Seneca writes, "He who can endure the greatest hardships without complaint is truly heroic." Meanwhile, the Confucian tradition, with its emphasis on ren, humaneness, and li, ritual propriety, would likely critique Hercules for his occasional disregard for the relational aspects of his deeds, urging a more harmonious integration of personal virtue with communal rights. By juxtaposing these perspectives, we see that the heroic ideal is not monolithic. It is a prism that refracts different ethical lights, each highlighting a facet of the moral character. Returning to Aristotle, let us examine his discussion of the voluntary and the involuntary in the context of Hercules' actions. Aristotle asserts that a virtuous act must be performed knowingly and willingly for it to be truly moral. In the myth, Hercules is often compelled by the will of the gods or by the edicts of Eurystheus, raising the question, are his labors truly voluntary? The answer lies in the hero's internalization of the divine command. He does not merely obey out of fear, he embraces the challenges as opportunities to perfect his character. When he decides to confront the Lernaean Hydra, he does so with the awareness that each severed head will spawn two more, yet he persists, displaying both courage and practical wisdom. This willingness to confront a seemingly impossible task illustrates Aristotle's claim that virtue involves deliberate choice. NE, Book III, 1116 billion. Thus, even when external forces set the stage, the hero's internal disposition determines whether the act is virtuous. The concept of eudaimonia, often translated as flourishing or human flourishing, is central to Aristotle's ethics. He argues that the highest good for a human being is to live a life of rational activity in accordance with virtue. Hercules' eventual apotheosis, his ascension to Olympus after death, can be read symbolically as the culmination of eudaimonia. The hero has completed the work of perfecting his character, aligning his rational capacities with the divine order. Yet, this mythic ending also raises a philosophical puzzle. If eudaimonia is achieved through a life of balanced virtues, does the hero's ultimate deification suggest that virtue alone is insufficient without divine favor? Some scholars, such as the Hellenistic philosopher Plutarch, argue that the hero's divine reward is a narrative device meant to reinforce the social value of virtue, not a literal endorsement of the need for supernatural approval. In modern virtue ethics, Philippa Foot's natural good theory offers a fresh angle on this puzzle. Foot contends that virtues are grounded in human nature and the conditions necessary for a flourishing life. She would likely interpret Hercules' apotheosis as a metaphor for the full actualization of human potential. When a person lives in accordance with the virtues that are natural to our species, we achieve a form of human divinity that transcends ordinary existence. Alasdair MacIntyre, on the other hand, would emphasize the narrative coherence of the hero's life. He argues that virtues acquire meaning only within a historical and communal story. The hero's journey, with its series of challenges and resolutions, provides a narrative structure that gives his virtues context and purpose. Without this story, the virtues would be isolated traits, lacking the richness that comes from being part of a larger tradition. Thus, both Foot and MacIntyre help us reconcile the mythic ending with the philosophical aim of eudaimonia, showing that the hero's story is both a moral exemplar and a cultural narrative. Let us now revisit the two counterarguments, this time probing them more deeply with concrete examples. The feminist critique, for instance, points to the episode of the Maidens of the Girdle, where Hercules captures the Cretan bull and then, in some versions, forces the daughters of King Minos into marriage. Critics argue that this reflects a patriarchal impulse to dominate and possess women, thereby undermining the hero's claim to moral superiority. In response, a virtue ethicist might ask, can we separate the hero's personal virtues from the cultural norms of his time? The answer may lie in distinguishing the hero's individual dispositions, courage, temperance, justice, from the societal structures that enable certain actions. By focusing on the hero's internal moral reasoning, we can critique the cultural context without discarding the value of his virtues altogether. The pragmatic critique, meanwhile, highlights the disparity between the heroic scale of Hercules' labors and the modest challenges faced by ordinary citizens. Consider a teacher who must confront systemic inequality in a public school. The teacher lacks the superhuman strength of Hercules, yet must demonstrate courage by speaking out against entrenched policies, temperance by managing limited resources, and justice by advocating for all students. The teacher's labors are less spectacular, but the virtue ethicist would argue that the same moral principles apply, scaled to the individual's capacity. Here, the hero's story serves as an inspirational template, not a literal benchmark. The teacher's success is measured not by the number of monsters slain, but by the consistency of virtuous action in everyday circumstances. To bring these reflections full circle, let us imagine a dialogue between Aristotle and a modern virtue ethicist. Aristotle might ask, what is the role of community in shaping virtue? Foot would answer, the community provides the practical contexts in which virtues are exercised. Without shared practices, virtues remain abstract. MacIntyre would add, and the community also supplies the narrative that gives those practices coherence. The hero of Hercules, then, becomes a bridge between the ancient and the modern. A figure who embodies the virtues Aristotle described, whose story was transmitted through gymnasia and chivalric orders, whose actions invite feminist and pragmatic scrutiny, and whose legacy continues to inform contemporary debates about what it means to live a good life. In the final analysis, the philosophy of Hercules is not a static doctrine but a living conversation across millennia. It invites us to ask, repeatedly, what courage looks like when we are not fighting literal beasts but confronting moral dilemmas in a world of complexity. It asks how temperance can be practiced when our culture bombards us with endless temptations, and how justice can be pursued when the structures of power seem immutable. By tracing the hero's labors through Aristotle's ethical framework, through medieval reinterpretations, through feminist and pragmatic critiques, and through the insights of modern virtue ethicists, we discover a rich tapestry of moral thought. This tapestry reminds us that virtue is not a distant ideal reserved for demigods, but a habit we can nurture, a mean we can aim for, and a story we can continually rewrite in the light of our own experiences. So as you walk your own path, whether you are a student in a university lecture hall, a parent navigating the demands of family life, or a citizen engaged in civic debate, consider the image of Hercules not as an unattainable legend, but as a mirror reflecting the possibilities of human character. Ask yourself, where in my life can I practice the measured courage of the Cretan bull, and how might I negotiate my own golden apples with justice and humility? In doing so, you join a tradition that stretches from the marble statues of ancient gymnasia to the modern classrooms of philosophy, a tradition that holds that the good life is forged through the repeated, reflective practice of virtue. The hero's journey, then, is not a distant saga, but an invitation to each of us to cultivate the virtues that allow us to flourish together in the shared story of humanity. Imagine, for a moment, the ancient hero Hercules standing at the threshold of his first labor, the Nemean lion, his muscles taut, his breath steady, the weight of destiny pressing upon his shoulders. What does this image speak to us today, when we consider the labyrinth of our own inner lives? Contemporary moral psychology invites us to read that scene not merely as a tale of brute strength, but as a vivid illustration of self-control in the face of a seemingly insurmountable impulse. The lion, with its impenetrable hide, becomes a metaphor for the automatic, defensive patterns that guard our psyche, a hardened exterior that resists change. In modern terms, we might call this the habit loop described by behavioral scientists. Cue, routine, reward. Hercules, by wrestling the beast barehanded, interrupts that loop, confronting the cue directly, disrupting the routine, and thereby rewiring his own response system. As the philosopher William James once noted, the greatest discovery of any generation is that a human being can alter his life by altering his attitude. In that first labor, we glimpse the embryonic moment of attitude change, the seed of resilience that will later blossom through the remaining 11 tasks. The second labor, the Lernaean Hydra, offers a richer illustration of how problems can multiply when we apply the wrong strategy. Each severed head sprouts two more, a cascade that mirrors what modern psychologists label problem escalation. Imagine a manager who, in trying to fix a workflow bottleneck, adds a new process, only to create additional layers of bureaucracy. The Hydra's regenerative heads become a vivid allegory for the feedback loops that amplify stress when we respond with sheer force rather than strategic insight. Hercules' eventual triumph, using fire to cauterize the necks, suggests a shift from reactive aggression to reflective containment. In moral psychology, this shift aligns with the concept of cognitive reappraisal, a technique wherein we reinterpret a stressor to reduce its emotional impact. By recognizing that the Hydra's heads are not independent threats but manifestations of a single underlying pathology, Hercules demonstrates the power of reframing. The ancient poet Pindar, in his Ode to the Hero, writes, "He burned the heads that grew anew, and with clever fire tamed the endless tide." The word clever is not incidental. It signals a move from brute strength to intelligent adaptation, a hallmark of moral development. When we move to the third labor, capturing the Cyrenian hind, our focus shifts to self-control of desire. The hind, sacred to Artemis, is swift, elusive, and bound by a divine injunction against harm. Hercules must pursue it for a full year, never striking it, merely guiding it back. Here, moral psychologists speak of delayed gratification, a capacity that the famous Stanford marshmallow experiments linked to later life outcomes such as academic achievement and emotional stability. The labor becomes a lived experiment in restraint. The hero must suppress the immediate urge to kill, honoring a higher ethical code. This mirrors Erik Erikson's third psychosocial stage, Initiative V's. Guilt, where the child learns to pursue goals while navigating the moral expectations of the community. By respecting the sanctity of the hind, Hercules avoids the guilt that would have followed a reckless act, thereby consolidating a sense of initiative grounded in ethical awareness. The ancient tragedian Sophocles, in his now lost Heracles at Cyrenia, is reported by later commentators to have dramatized this tension, showing the hero wrestling not just with the animal but with the inner voice that whispered, "Take it, you are a hero. You must prove yourself." The playwright's choice to emphasize the hero's internal monologue suggests that even in antiquity, audiences sense the psychological stakes of this labor. The fourth labor, the capture of the Erymanthian boar, adds another layer to our exploration of resilience. The boar, a creature of raw ferocity, charges the hero, testing his capacity to endure fear without surrender. Modern research on psychological hardiness identifies three components: commitment, control, and challenge. Hercules demonstrates commitment by refusing to abandon the pursuit despite the boar's feral onslaught. He asserts control by devising a trap, a strategic use of the terrain, rather than confronting the beast head-on. Finally, he reframes the encounter as a challenge, a test of skill, rather than a threat to his life. In Erikson's fourth stage, Industry V's inferiority, the adolescent learns to master tasks through competence. The boar then becomes a rite of passage, a crucible that forges industry. The playwright Euripides, in fragments of his Heracles at Thebes, reportedly juxtaposed the hero's triumph over the boar with the young protagonist's fear of failing his peers, underscoring the social dimension of this labor. The fifth labor, cleansing the Augean stables, is perhaps the most striking illustration of moral injury and the ethics of restitution. The stables, clogged with years of filth, symbolize a collective neglect, a societal sin that Hercules is called upon to rectify. Modern scholars of moral injury, such as Jonathan Shea, describe the deep wound that arises when one witnesses or participates in systemic wrongdoing. By diverting two rivers to wash away the waste, Hercules enacts a radical act of restoration, not merely punishment. He confronts the entrenched corruption of King Augeas, who promises a reward yet later reneges, thereby exposing the hero to betrayal. This betrayal echoes the trust violation component of moral injury, where the victim feels a profound sense of betrayal by those in authority. The labor also resonates with Erikson's fifth stage, identity versus role confusion, as Hercules must define his own moral identity apart from the expectations of kings and patrons. The ancient historian Diodorus Siculus records that a chorus in a lost Athenian tragedy lamented, "When the rivers run clean, the soul of the city breathes anew," a line that captures the civic dimension of moral repair. In the sixth labor, the slaying of the Stymphalian birds, we encounter the psychological phenomenon of avoidance. The birds, metallic and shrieking, terrorize the countryside, yet they remain out of reach, perched in high cliffs. Hercules cannot simply charge at them. He must first devise a method, using a rattle given by Hephaestus, to drive them into the open. This reflects the therapeutic principle that avoidance of a feared stimulus reinforces anxiety, whereas exposure, coupled with a concrete strategy, diminishes it. The hero's use of a tool to sound the alarm mirrors exposure therapy, where a patient gradually confronts the feared object while employing coping mechanisms. In Erikson's sixth stage, Intimacy V's isolation, the hero learns to collaborate, here with the god Hephaestus, to achieve a goal that cannot be accomplished alone. The myth, therefore, becomes a narrative of interdependence, a theme echoed in modern relational psychotherapy, which emphasizes that healing often requires a trusted other to hold the space while the individual confronts fear. The seventh labor, capturing the Cretan bull, introduces the theme of anger regulation. The bull, a manifestation of Poseidon's wrath, rampages across Crete, threatening the island's livelihood. Hercules must subdue, not kill, the animal, a task that demands patience and a measured response to a volatile force. Contemporary moral psychology speaks of emotion regulation, the ability to modulate one's affective states in alignment with long-term goals. By restraining the bull with a rope, the hero demonstrates an early model of distancing, a technique where one steps back from the immediate surge of anger to observe it objectively. This aligns with Erikson's seventh stage, generativity versus stagnation, where the mature adult seeks to contribute to the next generation, channeling personal vigor into constructive outcomes. The playwright Sophocles, whose lost Heracles in the Bull is known only through scholia, reportedly portrayed the hero's inner dialogue: "My strength is not for destruction, but for the safety of those I love." The line underscores the ethical pivot from raw power to purposeful stewardship. When we arrive at the eighth labor, the acquisition of the mares of Diomes, we confront the moral psychology of dehumanization and the reversal of it. The mares, fed on human flesh, embody the darkest extremes of cruelty. Hercules must tame them, turning beasts that have internalized violence into docile companions. In modern terms, this mirrors the process of rehumanization in conflict resolution, where an aggressor is guided to see victims as persons rather than objects. The hero's method, feeding the mares their own master, Diomes, creates a paradoxical moral lesson: that the source of cruelty can be turned against itself, prompting a re-evaluation of the moral order. Erickson's eighth stage, integrity versus despair, invites reflection on one's life narrative. By confronting the embodiment of cruelty and reshaping it, Hercules models an integrative process that allows for a coherent sense of self despite confronting the abyss. The poet Pindar, in his Epinician ode, writes, "He turned the devouring hounds into gentle steeds, and in doing so, taught the world that even the fiercest heart can be softened." The metaphor of the devouring hound serves as a vivid analog for the human capacity to perpetuate violence, and the hero's success illustrates the possibility of moral transformation. The ninth labor, the retrieval of the girdle of Hippolyta, brings the dynamics of cross-cultural encounter and the perils of miscommunication to the fore. The Amazons, a matriarchal society, present a challenge to the patriarchal expectations of Greek heroism. Hercules must negotiate the girdle, a symbol of female authority, without resorting to violence. Yet the myth records that Hera's meddling incites a battle, leading to Hippolyta's death. This tragic twist underscores the moral psychology of attribution error, where the hero attributes the conflict to external forces rather than his own assumptions about gender roles. Contemporary scholars of moral injury note that such misattributions can compound feelings of guilt and shame, especially when innocent lives are lost. In Erickson's ninth stage, ego integrity versus despair, the individual reflects on the totality of one's actions, reconciling successes with failures. The loss of Hippolyta forces Hercules to confront the unintended consequences of his quest, a moment of existential reckoning. The lost tragedy Heracles and the Amazons, as referenced by the Hellenistic scholar Athenaeus, reportedly ended with a chorus lamenting, "When pride blinds the heart, even the strongest arm cannot lift the weight of remorse." The line captures the psychological burden that follows a moral misstep. The 10th labor, the capture of the cattle of Geryon, is an odyssey across space and time, a narrative of perseverance and the management of future-oriented anxiety. Hercules must travel to the far west, confronting the three-bodied monster Geryon and his watchful herdsman, Eurytion. The hero's journey across the sea, through the realm of the sun god Helios, reflects the psychological process of temporal discounting, where individuals undervalue distant rewards in favor of immediate gratification. By committing to a long-term goal, retrieving the cattle despite the hardships, Hercules exemplifies the opposite, a capacity to delay gratification for a larger purpose. Modern cognitive behavioral therapy teaches that setting concrete, incremental milestones can reduce the anxiety associated with distant goals. In Erickson's 10th stage, intimacy vs. isolation, the hero's partnership with his companion Iolaus illustrates the importance of social support in sustaining long-term endeavors. The ancient playwright Euripides, in fragments of his Heracles at the Edge of the World, reportedly used the vastness of the sea as a metaphor for the inner ocean of doubt that every seeker must cross. He wrote, "The horizon stretches, but the heart must not be swayed, for the true cattle lie within the soul." The metaphor invites listeners to view external quests as reflections of internal longing. The 11th labor, the theft of the apples of the Hesperides, presents a classic case of ethical ambivalence. The golden apples, guarded by a dragon and the Hesperides, daughters of the night, represent knowledge, temptation, and the boundary between the known and the unknown. Hercules must navigate a garden that is both a paradise and a trap, confronting the paradox of desire for something that is forbidden. Contemporary moral psychology examines approach avoidance conflict, where an individual experiences simultaneous attraction and repulsion toward a stimulus. Hercules' solution, enlisting Atlas to retrieve the apples while he bears the sky, demonstrates strategic delegation, a form of cognitive flexibility that reframes the problem into manageable parts. This aligns with Erickson's 11th stage, generativity versus stagnation, where the mature adult seeks to leave a legacy by fostering growth in others. By sharing the burden with Atlas, the hero models mentorship. The ancient poet Callimachus, in a now lost hymn, praised the hero. He reached for the light that the night kept hidden, and in his grasp the world found a new dawn. The phrase, light that the night kept hidden, serves as an analogy for the hidden potential within our own shadows, waiting to be illuminated through courageous action. Finally, the 12th labor, the descent into the underworld to capture Cerberus, confronts the most primal of human fears, death anxiety. The hero must journey beyond the veil of mortality, face the three-headed guardian, and emerge unscathed. Contemporary existential psychology, following the work of Irvin Yalom, identifies death anxiety as a fundamental driver of human behavior, often manifesting in avoidance, denial, or overcompensation. Hercules' willingness to descend, to confront the very embodiment of death, illustrates an acceptance stance, a direct engagement with mortality that can diminish its terror. In cognitive behavioral terms, this is akin to exposure therapy for death-related fears, where repeated, controlled encounters reduce the intensity of the dread response. Erickson's 12th stage, ego integrity versus despair, culminates in a life review that integrates achievements and regrets. By returning from the underworld with Cerberus in tow, Hercules symbolically brings the shadow of death back into the realm of the living, suggesting that the living can integrate the knowledge of mortality without being consumed by it. The ancient tragedian Sophocles, in his lost Heracles and Hades, reportedly closed with a chorus that sang, "He who has walked among the dead knows the value of each sunrise." The line encapsulates the transformative power of confronting death anxiety. Having traced each labor through the lens of contemporary moral psychology, we can now map the hero's journey onto Erickson's 8-decade psychosocial model, revealing a striking parallelism. The first labor aligns with trust versus mistrust, as the infant Hercules learns that his own body can be a reliable tool against external threats. The second and third labs correspond to autonomy versus shame and doubt and initiative vs guilt, respectively, as the hero experiments with agency and negotiates the moral weight of his actions. The 4th through 6th labors echo industry versus inferiority, identity vs role confusion, and intimacy vs isolation, each demanding competence, self-definition, and relational collaboration. The 7th through 9th labs mirror generativity versus stagnation, ego integrity versus despair, and a return to integrity, as the hero's actions become increasingly oriented toward the welfare of the broader community and his own existential coherence. The final 3 labors, particularly the descent for Cerberus, culminate in the ultimate resolution of ego integrity versus despair, where the hero's life narrative is woven into a tapestry that embraces both triumph and loss, strength and vulnerability. Let us pause now to consider the 2 illustrative cases that illuminate the broader psychological patterns at work. First, the Hydra. Picture a modern manager faced with a cascade of employee complaints after implementing a new software system. Each complaint spawns another, as users discover hidden glitches, leading to a flood of support tickets. The manager, like Hercules, might initially respond by issuing more patches, inadvertently creating more problems, a classic Hydra effect. The cognitive behavioral critique would argue that such a response reinforces the problem loop, failing to address the underlying cause. Yet Hercules' eventual use of fire to cauterize the next models a different approach, a decisive, non-incremental intervention that cuts off the regenerative capacity of the issue. In therapeutic terms, this is akin to problem-focused coping, where the individual identifies the core stressor and applies a targeted solution rather than a series of superficial fixes. The myth thus teaches that escalation can be halted by shifting from reactive force to strategic containment. The second case, the descent into the underworld, offers a vivid template for confronting death anxiety. In contemporary psychotherapy, clients often report a fear of the unknown that paralyzes decision-making, especially when confronting terminal illness or the loss of a loved one. By visualizing the hero's journey, descending through the river Styx, confronting the gatekeeper, and facing Cerberus, clients can construct a narrative scaffold that frames death as a destination rather than a void. The hero's calm composure, his willingness to negotiate with Hades, and his eventual triumph illustrate the possibility of meaning-making in the face of mortality. Viktor Frankl, in his logotherapy, emphasized that meaning can be found even in suffering, and the myth of Hercules provides a mythic blueprint for that search. When the hero returns with the 3-headed dog, he demonstrates that the encounter with death does not diminish life. Instead, it enriches it with a deeper appreciation for each sunrise, as Sophocles' chorus once sang. Yet not all scholars accept this harmonious reading. Cognitive behavioral critics contend that mythic narratives, however elegant, oversimplify the complex, non-linear nature of mental processes. They argue that the labors present a linear progression, problem, solution, reward, that neglects the messy feedback loops, ambivalence, and regression often observed in real therapeutic work. A client may not move cleanly from self-control to resilience as Hercules does. Instead, they may oscillate between stages, experience setbacks, and encounter contradictory motivations. Moreover, the myth's emphasis on heroic agency can inadvertently promote a self-overcoming ethic that blames individuals for their failures, ignoring systemic and relational factors that contribute to psychological distress. This critique aligns with contemporary discussions about the limits of individualistic frameworks in mental health. Post-structuralist scholars push the critique further, suggesting that the labors reinforce a singular, oppressive narrative of self-overcoming that marginalizes alternative ways of being. Mitchell Foucault's analysis of power relations would highlight how the myth positions Hercules as the ultimate sovereign subject, whose body is a site of discipline and control, while the monsters he defeats embody otherness that must be subjugated. The Hydra, for instance, can be read as a symbol of social problems, poverty, disease, injustice, that are never truly eradicated but merely transformed into new forms when addressed through force alone. The descent into the underworld, then, becomes not a courageous confrontation with death, but a reinforcement of the hierarchical ordering that places the hero above the realm of the dead, perpetuating a binary of life versus death, self versus other. From this perspective, the labors are less a roadmap for moral development than a cultural script that legitimizes domination and the erasure of dissenting voices. In response to these critiques, contemporary thinkers have sought to reinterpret the myth through more nuanced lenses. James G. Carse, in his seminal work Finite and Infinite Games, distinguishes between games played for the purpose of winning and games played for the purpose of continuing the play. The labors, when read as finite games, become tasks with a clear endpoint, a monster slain, a cattle herd captured. Yet if we reconceptualize them as infinite games, the focus shifts to the ongoing process of self-exploration, where each labor is a move that opens new possibilities rather than a final victory. This perspective aligns with Buddhist concepts of non-attachment, which teach that clinging to outcomes, be they triumphs or defeats, generates suffering. By approaching the labors as opportunities for continual transformation, the hero can embody the Buddhist ideal of letting go, recognizing that the Hydra's heads are not enemies to be destroyed, but manifestations of impermanent conditions that arise and pass. The act of cauterizing the heads, then, becomes an act of mindful observation rather than domination, a way of seeing the pattern without being entangled in it. Similarly, the Buddhist notion of anicca, or impermanence, reframes the hero's encounter with the girdle of Hippolyta. The girdle, a symbol of power, is ultimately a transient object. Its loss does not diminish the hero's essence. In modern moral psychology, this resonates with the concept of self-compassion, where individuals recognize that their worth is not contingent upon external achievements. By integrating self-compassion, Hercules can navigate the guilt that follows Hippolyta's death without spiraling into despair, thereby maintaining psychological equilibrium. The ancient playwrights, though perhaps unaware of these modern terms, intuitively captured this balance. The lost tragedy Heracles and the Girdle reportedly concluded with a soliloquy in which the hero declares, "The metal upon my chest may rust, yet the virtue within remains untarnished." The line mirrors the Buddhist teaching that the true self is beyond form, impervious to the wear and tear of worldly trials. When we consider the broader cultural impact of the labors, we see how they have been reappropriated across centuries to illustrate moral lessons. In medieval allegory, the lion's hide became a symbol of spiritual armor. In Renaissance art, the Hydra was depicted as a representation of the chaotic forces of nature that the enlightened mind must tame. Even in contemporary popular culture, superhero narratives, video games, corporate leadership seminars, the structure of the 12 labors persists as a template for progressive challenge and growth. Yet each appropriation carries with it the risk of reinforcing the very oversimplifications that cognitive behavioral critics warn against. The hero's journey can become a checklist, a level-up system that ignores the relational and systemic dimensions of human flourishing. To honor the complexity of the myth while remaining faithful to the demands of moral psychology, we might adopt a hybrid approach. First, we acknowledge the labors as archetypal narratives that capture fundamental human experiences: fear, desire, guilt, resilience. Second, we integrate the insights of contemporary research, recognizing both the utility and the limits of the mythic framework. Third, we remain vigilant to the critiques that remind us of the dangers of a monolithic, triumph-oriented discourse. In practice, this could mean using the story of the Hydra as a teaching tool in therapy, but pairing it with a discussion of systemic factors that contribute to problem escalation. It could mean invoking the descent into the underworld as a metaphor for confronting death anxiety, while also addressing cultural attitudes toward mortality that shape that anxiety. In the final analysis, the 12 labors of Hercules serve as a rich tapestry upon which we can project the evolving understanding of moral psychology. Each labor, when examined through the lenses of self-control, moral injury, resilience, and identity formation, reveals a facet of the human condition that modern science continues to explore. The progression from the lion's hide to the underworld mirrors the developmental arc described by Erikson, suggesting that ancient storytellers possessed an intuitive grasp of the stages of personal growth. The historical anecdotes about Sophocles, Euripides, and the lost Athenian tragedies remind us that even in antiquity, playwrights used these myths to probe guilt, redemption, and the limits of heroic agency. The counterarguments, cognitive behavioral critiques, and post-structuralist deconstructions invite us to temper our admiration with critical inquiry, ensuring that we do not reduce complex mental processes to a simple sequence of feats. By cross-referencing Karse's notion of infinite games and Buddhist teachings on non-attachment, we open new pathways for interpreting the labors as ongoing processes rather than final conquests. As we close this segment, consider the following question. If you were to embark on your own set of 12 labors, what would be the first monster you would face, and how might you apply both the heroic courage of Hercules and the compassionate insight of modern psychology to meet it? The answer, perhaps, lies not in the number of heads you cut off, but in the depth of understanding you bring to each encounter. In the words of the ancient poet Pindar, the greatest victory is not over the foe, but over the self that doubts its own strength. Let that thought linger as we continue to explore the enduring dialogue between myth and mind. When we think of Hercules, the image that first rises is that of a colossal figure, muscles straining against the weight of a lion's hide, the club of his hand gleaming like a shaft of sunlight. Yet beyond the mythic labors that earned him a place among the gods, Hercules has been summoned again and again into the arena of political thought, a figure whose very name has become a shorthand for civic virtue, strength, and the promise of a society that can lift itself out of disorder. How did a demigod of ancient Greece become a banner for Roman republicanism, a symbol on the streets of revolutionary Paris, and later a tool in the propaganda machines of the 20th century? To answer that, we must trace the pathways through which Hercules was appropriated, reimagined, and contested, following the threads that bind myth to the lived realities of public life. The earliest political deployment of Heracles can be found in the very stone of Athens, where, in the 5th century BCE, the Athenians erected a modest sanctuary on the hill of the Agora, dedicated to the hero who had, according to local tradition, saved the city from the monstrous Minotaur. The anecdote recorded by Pausanias tells us that after the hero's return from his labors, the Athenians built a temple not merely to honor his strength, but to embody the ideal of self-sacrifice for the polis. For the city, the ancient chronicler writes, the hero's labors are a mirror of the citizen's duties, each task a step toward the common good. In that early moment, the link between personal heroism and civic responsibility was already being inscribed in marble, a connection that would echo through centuries. The Romans, ever adept at absorbing and reshaping Greek symbols, took the figure of Heracles and turned him into a model of Roman civic virtue, or virtus. In the Republic, the image of the hero was not confined to the arena of myth. It appeared on coins, on triumphal arches, and in the very language of statesmen. Cicero, in his treatise De Officiis, invokes Heracles as an exemplar of the magnanimous man who does not shrink from great deeds nor from the burdens that accompany them. He writes, just as Heracles bore the weight of the world upon his shoulders, so too must the Roman citizen bear the weight of his duties. For the health of the Republic depends upon the strength of each individual. This rhetorical move was not merely decorative. It was a deliberate attempt to align the personal virtues of the Roman elite with the mythic standards set by the hero, thereby creating a moral template for public service. The Roman appropriation was not a simple copy and paste. They reframed Heracles as a symbol of the civic rather than the personal hero. The hero's 12 labors, originally a series of challenges imposed by the gods, were recast as allegories for the struggles of the Republic. The slaying of the Nemean lion became a metaphor for overcoming internal corruption, the capture of the Cyrenian hind, a symbol of the pursuit of justice, the retrieval of the golden apples, an emblem of the restoration of prosperity. In this way, the Roman imagination turned mythic narrative into a political curriculum, teaching citizens how to interpret the challenges of their own age through the lens of ancient heroism. Fast forward to the Enlightenment, where the rationalist project of re-examining the foundations of society brought new attention to the role of myth in shaping political imagination. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in his discourse on the origin of inequality, does not speak of Hercules directly, yet his notion of the noble savage parallels the way Enlightenment thinkers reimagined the ancient hero as a symbol of uncorrupted virtue. Rousseau writes, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. The chains are not the work of the tyrant, but the result of the loss of his natural state, a state that resembles the heroic purity of the ancient demigod." Though Rousseau never names Heracles, his philosophy invites us to see the hero as a benchmark for an untainted moral order, a point of reference that later revolutionaries would seize upon with fervor. It was precisely in the crucible of the French Revolution that Hercules re-emerged with a renewed political vigor. The revolutionary government, intent on forging a new civic identity that broke with the ancient regime, commissioned a series of public monuments that would embody the virtues they sought to instill. Among these, the Statue of the Republic, unveiled in 1793, stands as a striking example. The sculptor, Pierre Jean David Dangers, fashioned a colossal figure reminiscent of Heracles, but with a distinctly republican twist. The Heroes Club was replaced by a fasces, the bundle of rods that symbolized collective strength, and his lion's skin was draped with the tricolor flag of France. In the accompanying pamphlet, the revolutionary poet Henry Gregoire proclaimed, "Here stands Hercules reborn, not as a slave to the gods, but as a servant of the people, a guardian of liberty." The statue's placement in the Place du Carrousel, a former royal thoroughfare, was a deliberate act of resignification, turning a space of monarchical power into a stage for the hero's civic message. The symbolism was not limited to stone and bronze. Revolutionary pamphlets and political cartoons proliferated images of Hercules lifting the weight of the nation, his sinewy arms bearing the burdens of war, famine, and political upheaval. In a widely circulated engraving titled "Hercules and the People," the hero is shown holding a plow in one hand and a sword in the other, a visual synthesis of agriculture and defense that encapsulated the revolutionary ideal of a citizen soldier. The rhetoric surrounding these images was explicit. The Republic called upon its citizens to emulate the hero's perseverance, to take up the club of virtue, and conquer the monsters of tyranny. In doing so, the revolutionaries made Hercules a living, breathing part of the public imagination, a mythic anchor for the abstract principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity. The 19th century saw a revival of classical motifs across Europe, and the neoclassical movement brought a new wave of public sculptures that reimagined Hercules for modern civic spaces. In Paris, the Place de la Concorde was adorned with a bronze group by the sculptor François Rude, titled "The Triumph of the Republic," wherein a muscular figure reminiscent of Heracles leads a procession of allegorical figures representing liberty and the people. Meanwhile, in Vienna, the Heldenplatz Heroes Square was populated with statues of ancient heroes, including a towering Heracles whose club pointed toward the sky, symbolizing the city's aspirations toward moral elevation. These commissions were not mere decorative projects, they were deliberate political statements, intended to remind citizens that the virtues of antiquity, courage, self-discipline, civic duty, were still relevant in the age of industrialization and nation-building. The appropriation of Hercules did not stop at the borders of Europe. In the United States, early Republicans invoked the hero to illustrate the virtues of the new nation. Thomas Jefferson, in a letter to James Madison, wrote, "The strength of our republic must be as the might of Hercules. It must endure the labors of governance without succumbing to the temptations of tyranny." Though the United States never erected a monumental Heracles in its capital, the metaphor persisted in political discourse, shaping the language of civic virtue that undergirded early American republicanism. The 20th century, with its unprecedented technological advances and the rise of mass media, provided new platforms for the deployment of mythic symbols. The most striking example comes from the propaganda of the Italian fascist regime under Benito Mussolini. The regime commissioned a series of posters and statues that depicted Heracles as the embodiment of the new Roman man, a figure of disciplined strength, unyielding will, and unquestioned loyalty to the state. One particularly striking poster, designed by the artist Mario Ciarni, shows a muscular Heracles standing atop a pile of broken chains, his gaze fixed upon a distant horizon. Beneath the image, the caption reads, "Il nuovo eroe dell'Italia," the new hero of Italy. Mussolini himself, in a speech to the National Council, declared, "We shall forge a nation as strong as Heracles, a people that will lift the burdens of the world with the ease of a demigod." The use of the hero here was not simply decorative. It was a calculated attempt to fuse ancient Roman glory with contemporary nationalist fervor, creating a mythic lineage that legitimized the regime's authoritarian ambitions. Across the Atlantic, Nazi Germany also turned to classical imagery, though often favoring the Viking or Nordic archetypes. Yet even within that aesthetic, the motif of the Herculean labor resurfaced in the form of massive public works, such as the Reichstagbahn, which were portrayed as the modern equivalent of the hero's labors, conquering the terrain, taming nature, and forging a new empire. Joseph Goebbels, the minister of propaganda, wrote in his diary, "Our roads are the Nemean lion's skin. Each mile we lay is a triumph over the chaos that threatened the fatherland." While the hero's name was not always explicitly invoked, the underlying narrative of monumental effort and heroic conquest was unmistakable, demonstrating how the mythic template of Hercules could be adapted to serve divergent political ends. These historical moments illustrate the flexibility of the Hercules myth in political discourse, but they also invite critical scrutiny. Marxist thinkers, for instance, have long warned against the deployment of heroic myth as a tool of bourgeois domination. In his essay, The Hero and the Proletariat, George Lukács argues that the glorification of individual strength serves to obscure the collective nature of social struggle. He writes, "The hero becomes a mirror in which the bourgeoisie sees its own self-interest reflected, a way to naturalize the dominance of the few over the many." From this perspective, the image of Hercules is not a neutral emblem of virtue, but a rhetorical device that reinforces existing power structures, diverting attention from systemic exploitation to the celebration of singular, exceptional individuals. A liberal feminist critique offers a complementary line of objection, focusing on the gendered dimensions of the heroic narrative. Simone de Beauvoir in The Second Sex observes that the mythic hero embodies the masculine ideal of power, autonomy, and mastery over nature, thereby marginalizing alternative conceptions of virtue that are associated with the feminine. She writes, "When a society elevates Hercules as the model citizen, it simultaneously devalues the qualities of empathy, cooperation, and relationality that have been traditionally ascribed to women." Contemporary feminist scholars extend this critique to modern political rhetoric, noting that the repeated invocation of Herculean strength in policy debates, whether regarding economic recovery, military intervention, or infrastructural development, often sidelines discussions of care work, social welfare, and communal responsibility. In this reading, the hero becomes a symbol of exclusion, reinforcing a patriarchal vision of the public sphere that privileges masculine forms of power. These counterarguments do not render the Hercules motif irrelevant. Rather, they compel us to interrogate the conditions under which the hero is mobilized and the purposes it serves. When we return to the ancient sources, we find that even the Greeks were aware of the ambivalence surrounding their own hero. In the tragedy Heracles by Euripides, the hero returns from his final labor to find his family destroyed by madness, a punishment inflicted by Hera. The chorus laments, "Even the strongest of men cannot escape the whims of fate." This ancient dramatization warns that heroic strength is not an unconditional guarantee of moral success, a caution that resonates with modern political warnings about the dangers of unbridled power. Plato's Republic offers another point of comparison. The philosopher outlines the guardian class as the ideal rulers, individuals who possess both physical vigor and philosophical wisdom. While Plato does not name Hercules, his description of the guardian's harmonious soul bears a striking resemblance to the ancient hero's balance of might and moral purpose. He writes, "The guardian must be as strong as the lion, yet as just as the law." This Platonic ideal suggests that the heroic archetype can be refined, that strength must be coupled with reason and justice. Modern democratic theorists such as Robert Putnam echo this sentiment when they speak of social capital as the civic equivalent of Herculean effort, the collective ability to cooperate, to trust, to build institutions that endure. The contemporary relevance of Hercules in public life can be observed in the language of political campaigns and policy debates. In the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, U.S. President Barack Obama, addressing Congress, said, "We must summon the Herculean resolve to rebuild our economy, to restore confidence, to lift the burden from ordinary families." The metaphor of Herculean effort was invoked not as a celebration of individual heroism, but as a call for collective action, a recognition that the challenges ahead required a concerted, sustained effort. Similarly, in the European Union's response to the refugee crisis, officials have spoken of a Herculean task of compassion, framing the humanitarian response as a moral labor that demands both strength and empathy. Analogies drawn from the myth itself help illuminate these contemporary applications. Consider the labors of Heracles as a series of problem-solving episodes, each requiring a unique combination of strategy, endurance, and moral judgment. The first labor, slaying the Nemean lion, represents confronting a seemingly invulnerable threat. In modern terms, it could be likened to the fight against entrenched corruption or a pandemic that defies conventional treatments. The second labor, defeating the Lernaean Hydra, teaches us about the perils of solutions that spawn new problems, a lesson that resonates with climate policy, where each intervention must be assessed for unintended consequences. By mapping each labor onto a contemporary challenge, we can see how the myth offers a flexible template for understanding the complexity of public governance. Historical anecdotes further enrich our understanding of how the hero has been physically manifested in civic spaces. The construction of the Temple of Heracles on the island of Aegina, for instance, was a community effort that spanned generations. Archaeologists have uncovered inscriptions indicating that local citizens contributed both labor and funds, viewing the temple not merely as a religious site, but as a civic monument that embodied their collective identity. One inscription reads, "We, the sons of Aegina, raise this sanctuary so that the hero's strength may guard our city." The temple's dedication ceremony was accompanied by a public feast, a ritual that reinforced the bond between mythic heroism and communal solidarity. Another anecdote comes from the 19th century reconstruction of the Piazza del Popolo in Rome, where the architect Giuseppe Valadier commissioned a series of neoclassical statues, including a towering figure of Heracles holding the apple of the Hesperides. The statue was positioned at the entrance to the city, serving as a symbolic guardian for travelers and citizens alike. Valadier wrote in his design diary, "The hero stands at the threshold, reminding all who pass that the city is built upon the virtues of courage and perseverance." The public reception was enthusiastic. Citizens gathered for a procession, singing hymns that praised both the ancient hero and the modern city's aspirations. This event illustrates how the myth was woven into the fabric of urban identity, a visual and performative reminder that civic virtue could be celebrated through shared cultural symbols. The interplay between myth and politics is not a one-way street. While political actors harness the hero for their own ends, the public's reception of these symbols can reshape the myth itself. In the aftermath of World War II, for example, the Allied powers dismantled many of the fascist monuments that had employed Heracles' imagery, viewing them as tainted by association with authoritarian regimes. Yet rather than erasing the hero, this act sparked a re-evaluation of what Heracles could represent in a democratic context. Artists and thinkers began to emphasize the hero's capacity for redemption, his willingness to endure suffering for the sake of others, a narrative that aligned with post-war ideals of reconstruction and reconciliation. The modern discourse on civic virtue continues to grapple with the relevance of the Herculean model. In contemporary democratic societies, debates about the balance between individual rights and collective responsibilities often invoke the language of strength and labor. Political philosopher Martha Nussbaum, in her work on capabilities, argues that a flourishing democracy requires citizens to develop not only intellectual capacities, but also the practical strength to act in the world. A notion that resonates with the ancient ideal of the hero who must both think and act. She writes, "The citizen who can lift the weight of injustice, who can confront the monsters of inequality, embodies the spirit of the ancient hero in a manner that is compatible with democratic equality." By reframing the hero's strength as a collective capability, Nussbaum offers a way to retain the inspirational power of the myth while mitigating its exclusionary tendencies. Conversely, critics such as Chantal Mouffe caution against the seductive allure of heroic narratives that can mask the contested nature of democratic politics. In her theory of agonistic pluralism, she warns that the glorification of a singular, heroic figure can suppress the necessary conflict and debate that sustain a vibrant democracy. She asks, when we celebrate a Herculean figure, do we not risk silencing the voices of those who cannot, or choose not to, lift such burdens? This question invites us to consider whether the very language of heroism might inadvertently marginalize those whose contributions lie in quieter, less visible forms of civic engagement. The tension between the inspirational and the problematic aspects of the Hercules motif is perhaps most evident in contemporary nationalist movements that appropriate the hero for exclusionary agendas. In the early 21st century, certain far-right groups in Europe have adopted the image of Heracles as a symbol of cultural purity and defensive strength, often pairing the hero with slogans that denigrate immigrants and minorities. A poster circulating in a French nationalist rally depicts a muscular Heracles standing before a wall, his club poised to strike with the caption, "Defend the nation," as Heracles defended his realm. Such imagery resurrects the ancient narrative of the hero defending his territory, but reinterprets it in a way that fuels xenophobia and undermines the inclusive civic virtues that the hero once represented. The appropriation demonstrates how the same myth can be wielded to both uplift and oppress, depending on the ideological lens through which it is viewed. In contrast, progressive movements have reclaimed the Hercules narrative to highlight collective resilience. During the global climate strikes, activists have used the metaphor of Herculean effort to describe the massive societal changes required to curb carbon emissions. A speech delivered at a United Nations climate conference opened with the line, "We stand at the foot of a mountain as tall as the labors of Heracles. Our task is not for a single hero, but for all of humanity." The speaker's intent was to transform the solitary image of the hero into a metaphor for shared responsibility, emphasizing that the true strength lies in coordinated action rather than individual prowess. These divergent uses of the same myth underscore a crucial point. Symbols are not static, they acquire meaning through the context in which they are invoked. The ancient hero's narrative, with its blend of extraordinary strength, moral ambiguity, and ultimate redemption, offers a rich tapestry upon which societies can project their hopes, fears, and values. Whether used to legitimize authoritarian power, to inspire democratic renewal, or to critique systemic injustice, Hercules remains a potent rhetorical device because it can be reshaped to reflect the prevailing ideological currents. Returning to the classical roots, we find that even the ancient philosophers were wary of the dangers of uncritical hero worship. Aristotle, in his Nicomachean Ethics, distinguishes between the great man, whose virtues are cultivated through habit, and the natural hero, whose talents are innate but untempered by moral training. He writes, "The greatness of a man is not measured by the force of his arms, but by the harmony of his soul." This Platonic Aristotelian caution resonates with modern concerns about the elevation of charismatic leaders who may lack the institutional checks that safeguard democratic governance. The ancient warning reminds us that strength without virtue can become a source of tyranny rather than a foundation for the common good. The philosophical lineage continues through modern thinkers such as John Stuart Mill, who, in On Liberty, emphasizes the importance of individual development within the framework of societal liberty. Mill's argument that the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community, against his will, is to prevent harm to others, can be read alongside the myth of Heracles, whose labors often involved protecting the innocent from monstrous threats. In this reading, the hero's strength is justified only when it serves the protection of others, not the aggrandizement of self. The parallel offers a normative criterion for evaluating when the invocation of heroic imagery is morally defensible. The contemporary relevance of these philosophical reflections is evident in ongoing debates about civic education. In many democracies, curricula are being revised to include discussions of myth, symbolism, and their political uses. A recent policy paper by the European Commission on Civic Values in Education recommends that students explore the role of mythic heroes such as Hercules in shaping ideas of citizenship, responsibility, and public service. The paper argues that by critically examining how ancient narratives have been repurposed across history, learners can develop a nuanced understanding of how symbols function in public discourse, and how they can be harnessed for inclusive, democratic ends. This educational initiative reflects a growing awareness that the stories we tell about our past are instrumental in shaping the political imagination of the future. In sum, the journey of Hercules from the ancient hearth of Greek myth to the marble squares of modern capitals illustrates a remarkable continuity and adaptability. The hero's image has been a mirror in which societies see themselves reflected, a canvas upon which political actors paint their aspirations, fears, and ideologies. From the Roman Republic's coinage to the revolutionary statues of Paris, from fascist propaganda to climate activism, the Herculean motif has served as a versatile rhetorical tool, capable of both uniting and dividing, of inspiring collective action and justifying exclusion. The counterarguments offered by Marxist and feminist critiques remind us that the hero's narrative can conceal power dynamics and gendered hierarchies, urging us to interrogate the underlying assumptions that accompany any invocation of strength and virtue. Yet the myth also offers a hopeful possibility. By reimagining Hercules not as an isolated figure of masculine might, but as a symbol of collective resilience, ethical labor, and the pursuit of the common good, we can reclaim the hero for a democratic project that values inclusivity, reason, and compassion. As Plato suggested, the ideal guardian must combine physical vigor with philosophical wisdom. As Rousseau hinted, the noble spirit of the hero can serve as a touchstone for a more authentic human nature. As Nussbaum proposes, the capabilities that allow citizens to lift burdens together are the true modern Herculean achievements. In this light, the ancient labors become a metaphor for the ongoing work of building societies that can stand, as Hercules once did, against the chaos of the world, not through domination, but through the harmonious balance of strength, justice, and shared humanity. The story of Hercules in political philosophy and public life, therefore, is not a closed chapter but an open dialogue, a conversation that stretches across millennia, inviting each generation to ask anew. What does it mean to be strong? What does it mean to serve? And how can the myths we inherit be transformed into tools for a more equitable, resilient, and compassionate public sphere? As we contemplate these questions, the echo of the hero's labors continues to reverberate, reminding us that the pursuit of civic virtue is itself a kind of labor, one that, like the tasks of Heracles, may never be fully completed, yet remains essential to the flourishing of any community. The path forward, then, may be best imagined not as a single heroic stride, but as a collective march, each step a small labor, each effort a contribution to the larger, ever-unfolding saga of the public good. The story of Heracles has always been more than a catalogue of monstrous feats. It is a meditation on the human condition, a template for confronting the impossible, and a mirror in which each generation sees its own anxieties reflected. When we speak of Heracles today, we are not merely recalling the ancient Greek hero who wrestled the Nemean lion or fetched the golden apples of the Hesperides. We are invoking a philosophical archetype that has been reshaped by the pens of Plato, the treatises of Aristotle, the dramas of Euripides, and the modern essays of existentialists and virtue ethicists. In this segment, we will trace how that ancient archetype reverberates through our contemporary ethical dilemmas: climate activism, the rise of artificial intelligence, the disciplined pursuit of athletic excellence, and the courageous act of whistleblowing, while also entertaining the skeptical voices that dismiss heroic narratives altogether. As we move through these layers, we will hear the words of the ancient poets, the insights of modern thinkers, and the lived experiences of artists and community builders who have taken Heracles' labors as a canvas for their own projects. To understand why Heracles continues to speak to us, we must first recall the origins of his myth. The earliest references appear in the Hesiodic Catalogue of Women, where Heracles is introduced as the son of Zeus and Alcmene, a mortal woman whose lineage ties him to the house of Perseus. Hesiod writes, Heracles, born of the divine and the mortal, bears the weight of two natures, and his destiny is to bridge the gap between heaven and earth. This duality, divine potential coupled with human limitation, creates the tension that fuels every labor. Later, Pindar in his Olympian odes celebrates the hero's triumphs with a lyrical emphasis on perseverance. I sing of Heracles, who, though he bears the burden of 100 tasks, never ceases to rise, for his heart is a furnace that refuses to be quenched. The image of the furnace recurs in later dramatists. Euripides in his tragedy Heracles portrays the hero's suffering as a crucible of moral testing, noting, the fire that burns within him is not of the gods but of his own resolve. Philosophers of antiquity seized upon this narrative to explore ethics. Aristotle in his Nicomachean Ethics references Heracles as an exemplar of the golden mean, arguing that the hero's virtue lies not in reckless strength but in the calibrated balance between excess and deficiency. He writes, the virtuous man, like Heracles, knows when to wield his power and when to restrain it, for virtue is a habit of choice that aligns with reason. Plato, on the other hand, uses Heracles in the Republic as a foil to the philosopher king, suggesting that raw physical might must be tempered by philosophical insight. In the Symposium, the character Phaedrus recalls the hero's labors as a metaphor for the soul's ascent. Just as Heracles clears the Augean stables, the lover must cleanse the soul of base desires to reach true beauty. These ancient reflections set the stage for a modern philosophical conversation that asks, what does it mean to be a hero in an age defined not by monsters of myth, but by systemic crises and algorithmic complexities? The first contemporary resonance we encounter is with climate activism, an arena where the metaphor of the Augean stables has become a potent symbol. The ancient labor required Heracles to divert two rivers, Alpheus and Peneus, to wash away the filth that had accumulated over generations of neglect. In today's world, the filth is the accumulation of carbon emissions, plastic waste, and ecological degradation that humanity has allowed to settle in the planet's own stables. Climate activists, from Greta Thunberg to the indigenous leaders of the Standing Rock movement, embody a modern Heracles who must confront a system so vast that the very notion of diverting rivers seems both literal and metaphorical. Consider the case of the Ocean Cleanup Project, founded by Boyan Slat, which seeks to remove plastic from the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. The initiative can be seen as a contemporary attempt to clean the Augean stables of our oceans. The project's engineers designed massive floating barriers that harness ocean currents, much like the ancient hero harnessed the power of rivers to concentrate debris and facilitate its removal. Yet, as with Heracles' labor, the task is not merely technical, it is ethical. The philosopher Timothy Morton, in his work on dark ecology, reminds us that the very act of cleaning presupposes a relationship of responsibility to the thing being cleaned. In this sense, the activist's labor mirrors the hero's moral calculus. To intervene is to assume responsibility, and to assume responsibility is to accept the risk of failure. The second contemporary arena where Heracles' myth finds fresh expression is the realm of artificial intelligence, particularly the metaphor of the Hydra. In the original myth, Heracles confronts the Lernaean Hydra, a serpentine monster that regenerates 2 heads for each one cut off. The Hydra's regenerative capacity has become a vivid analogy for the proliferating challenges posed by AI, algorithmic bias, autonomous weapons, deepfake technology, and the unintended consequences of self-learning systems. Each attempt to cut off a problematic aspect of AI seems to spawn new, more complex issues, echoing the Hydra's endless heads. Take, for instance, the controversy surrounding facial recognition software. When civil liberties groups demand bans on its use, tech companies often respond by refining the algorithms, claiming improvements in accuracy. Yet, each refinement may introduce new privacy concerns or exacerbate surveillance capacities. In a 2023 symposium on AI ethics, philosopher Nick Bostrom described the Hydra metaphor explicitly. We are in a battle with a creature whose heads are not merely biological but informational. Every solution we devise creates a new node of complexity. The modern Heracles, therefore, must adopt a strategy akin to that of his ancient counterpart. He must enlist the help of Iolaus, his nephew, who cauterizes the Hydra's necks to prevent regrowth. In contemporary terms, this translates into interdisciplinary collaboration. Ethicists, engineers, policymakers, and affected communities must work together to cauterize the proliferating heads of AI, ensuring that each cut is accompanied by safeguards that prevent regrowth. Beyond these macro-scale challenges, the hero's narrative also informs individual quests for meaning. The modern athlete who trains for an Olympic marathon embodies a labor of self-discipline that resonates deeply with the ancient hero's relentless pursuit of excellence. Marathon training is not merely a physical regimen, it is a disciplined practice that shapes character, tests endurance, and refines purpose. When Eliud Kipchoge, the Kenyan long-distance runner, famously declared, "Only the disciplined mind can conquer the distance," he echoed the ancient sentiment that virtue is forged through repeated, arduous effort. Kipchoge's daily routine, early morning runs, meticulous diet, mental visualization, parallels Heracles' methodical approach to each labor. Each mile becomes a symbolic boar of Eurystheus, a challenge that must be faced with both strength and strategic planning. The psychological dimension of this athletic labor aligns with Viktor Frankl's logotherapy, which posits that meaning arises from purposeful action, even amid suffering. Frankl writes, "When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves." The marathon runner, faced with the inevitability of fatigue, pain, and the limits of the human body, finds meaning not in the outcome of winning a medal, but in the act of transcending personal limits. This mirrors Heracles' final labor, capturing Cerberus, the 3-headed guard of the underworld, where the hero's triumph is less about the external reward and more about the internal transformation that occurs when confronting mortality. In a different vein, the whistleblower who confronts corporate corruption embodies a New Age Heracles, a figure who steps into the abyss of power to expose hidden malfeasance. Consider the case of Francis Hawkins, a data analyst at a multinational oil corporation who, after discovering systematic falsification of emission reports, leaked internal documents to environmental NGOs. Her act of disclosure is akin to Heracles' slaying of the Stymphalian birds, whose metallic feathers threatened the safety of the surrounding countryside. Hawkins' whistleblowing, however, comes at a personal cost. Legal retaliation, professional ostracism, and threats to personal safety. Yet, as the ancient hero endured the wrath of Eurystheus, so too does the modern whistleblower endure institutional wrath, guided by a higher moral compass. Frankl's insistence on the will to meaning offers a philosophical framework for understanding this sacrifice. He writes, "The meaning of life is to be found in every moment of living. It is not a distant goal but a present responsibility." Hawkins' decision to act, despite the personal risk, reflects an internalized sense of responsibility that transcends immediate self-interest. Her story also resonates with Camus' concept of the absurd hero, who persists in the face of a universe that offers no guarantee of justice. Camus famously declares in the myth of Sisyphus, "One must imagine Sisyphus happy." The whistleblower, like Sisyphus, may see the task as endless, yet finds purpose in the very act of pushing the stone, of revealing truth. The artistic realm offers yet another lens through which Heracles is reinterpreted for our times. Anish Kapoor's installation titled Hercules, 2021, presents a massive, reflective steel sculpture that appears to be both a weight and a mirror. Viewers are invited to stand beneath its curved surface, confronting their own reflections distorted by the curvature, much as Heracles confronted his own image in the pool of the river Styx when he sought immortality. Kapoor's work is not a literal retelling of the labors, but an invitation to contemplate the burden of self-knowledge and the paradox of strength, that true power lies in the capacity to see oneself honestly. In a 2022 interview, Kapoor remarked, "The hero is not the one who lifts the world, but the one who can look at his own reflection and still move forward." This sentiment echoes the ancient philosopher's warning that pride precedes a fall, a caution that Heracles himself learned when he succumbed to a moment of madness and killed his own children. Community projects named after Heracles' labors further illustrate how the myth can galvanize collective action. In the town of Pylos, Greece, a local environmental group called Augean Hands has organized a river cleaning initiative that brings together fishermen, schoolchildren, and municipal officials to clear plastic debris from the Pinios River. The project's name evokes the ancient labor, but its execution is fundamentally collaborative. No single individual bears the entire burden. The group's founder, Maria Costas, often cites the ancient story during her speeches. "We are not alone in this task, we are a chorus of Iolauses, each of us adding a hand to cauterize the wounds of our river." The success of such initiatives demonstrates a pragmatic ethic that values incremental, collective effort over singular heroic acts. In contrast, the myth of Heracles traditionally celebrates the solitary hero, a narrative that modern ethicists like Peter Singer critique for its potential to overlook systemic responsibility. Here we encounter two robust counterarguments to the heroic framing. The first emerges from nihilist philosophy, which denies any intrinsic meaning or moral hierarchy. Friedrich Nietzsche, though often misread as a champion of the Übermensch, also warned against the last man who seeks comfort in herd morality, suggesting that the hero's narrative can become a comforting illusion that masks the abyss of meaninglessness. A contemporary nihilist, such as the writer Eugene Thacker, might argue that invoking Heracles in climate activism merely romanticizes an impossible struggle, obscuring the reality that the planet's systems may be beyond any single agency's capacity to repair. He would contend the hero myth is a narrative device that allows us to pretend we are masters of a world that is indifferent to our labors. From this perspective, the very act of casting climate activists as modern Heracles could be seen as a form of mythic self-delusion, a way of avoiding the acceptance of existential void. The second counterargument comes from pragmatic ethicists who prioritize incremental, collective action over the mythic individual. Amartya Sen, in his work on capabilities, argues that social progress is best achieved through the expansion of freedoms and the reduction of structural injustices, rather than through the glorification of singular heroic deeds. He writes, "Development is not the story of a lone savior, but the unfolding of opportunities for many." In the context of AI governance, scholars like Virginia Dignam advocate for human-centered AI that involves multi-stakeholder deliberation, emphasizing that no single heroic technologist can anticipate every downstream effect. These pragmatic voices caution that the hero narrative can inadvertently reinforce a great man view of history, which sidelines the contributions of ordinary people and undermines the democratic potential of collective agency. Both counterarguments invite us to re-examine the utility of the heroic model. Yet, rather than discarding the myth entirely, a nuanced approach can integrate the strengths of the hero's symbolism with the humility of collective action. This synthesis is reflected in contemporary virtue ethics movements, which draw on Aristotelian ideas of character formation while emphasizing community practices. Philosophers like Philippa Foot and Rosalind Hursthouse argue that virtues are cultivated within social contexts, and that heroic virtues, courage, perseverance, temperance, must be exercised responsibly, with attention to the common good. In this framework, the modern Heracles is not a lone savior but a participant in a larger moral ecosystem, whose individual excellence serves to inspire and mobilize others. Let us return to the ancient texts for a moment to hear the voice of the hero himself. In the Bibliotheca of Apollodorus, Heracles declares, "I have endured the weight of 100 tasks. Each labor has taught me that the world does not yield to force alone, but to wisdom and humility." This self-reflection, often overlooked in popular retellings, underscores a principle that resonates with modern virtue ethics. The hero's strength is inseparable from his capacity for self-knowledge. Similarly, in Euripides' tragedy, the dying Heracles, after completing his labors, laments, "The gods have given me might, but they have also given me sorrow. I would have traded my strength for the peace of a simple life, were it not for the promise I made to my people." The promise, an implicit social contract, mirrors the modern expectation that those with power bear responsibility toward the broader community. When we examine the modern athlete, the marathon runner, we can see this promise in action. Eliud Kipchoge's Breaking to project, which aimed to run a marathon in under 2 hours, was not solely a personal triumph. It was a collaborative experiment involving engineers, nutritionists, and sports psychologists. The project's success, though the 2-hour barrier was ultimately broken in a controlled environment, demonstrated that individual excellence is amplified when embedded within a network of expertise. Kipchoge himself reflected on this in a 2020 interview. "I run not just for myself, but for every child who sees a runner on the street and believes they can move forward." His words echo the ancient hero's duty to inspire and uplift, yet they also acknowledge the interdependence that modern virtue ethics emphasizes. The whistleblower's narrative also illustrates this interdependence. Frances Hawkins, after her disclosures, joined a coalition of environmental NGOs, legal scholars, and policy advocates to push for stricter emissions reporting standards. Her individual acts sparked a ripple effect, leading to legislative hearings and eventually a revision of the corporate reporting framework. In a testimony before the Senate Environment Committee, she quoted the ancient poet Pindar. "The hero's fame is not measured by the number of his labors, but by the lasting impact of his deeds." Her testimony underscored that heroic action, when coupled with collective advocacy, can reshape institutions, a modern echo of Heracles' final labor of retrieving Cerberus, which required navigating the underworld's complex bureaucracy. The artistic reinterpretation by Anish Kapoor adds yet another dimension. In his Hercules installation, the reflective surface not only mirrors the viewer, but also captures the ambient sounds of the gallery, a low, resonant hum that shifts as people move. This auditory element symbolizes the echoes of past labors, reminding us that each heroic act reverberates through time, influencing future generations. Kapoor's work, exhibited alongside a community mural titled Augean Stables, Our River, Our Responsibility, created a dialogue between high art and grassroots activism. The mural, painted by local youth in the coastal town of Larnaca, depicts a stylized river being cleared by a group of hands, each hand representing a different profession: fishermen, teachers, engineers, working together. The mural's caption, drawn from the ancient myth, reads, "One river, many hands, a shared destiny." This collaborative visual narrative embodies the pragmatic ethicist's call for collective action while retaining the heroic symbolism that motivates participants. Historical anecdotes further illuminate how the Heraclean motif has been mobilized across centuries. In the early 20th century, during the construction of the Panama Canal, engineers faced the monumental task of draining the swamps and controlling the Chagres River, an effort that contemporaries likened to cleaning the Augean stables. The chief engineer, John Franklin Glover, famously wrote in his diary, "We are modern Heracles, wrestling the serpents of disease and mud. And each day we carve a path for civilization." The metaphor served both as motivation and as a moral justification for the massive labor force, including thousands of laborers from the Caribbean and Central America, whose contributions were often downplayed in the heroic narrative. This historical episode reminds us that the hero myth can be wielded to both empower and obscure, a tension that modern ethicists must navigate. A second anecdote comes from the post-World War II era, when the United Nations established the International Labour Organization, ILO, to address the labors of rebuilding societies devastated by conflict. The ILO's founding charter invoked the notion of human dignity as a collective labor, drawing on the ancient Greek concept of eudaimonia, human flourishing achieved through virtuous activity. In a 1948 address, ILO Secretary General Edward J. Brown declared, "Our task is akin to that of Heracles. We must cleanse the stables of exploitation, protect the weak from the hydra of injustice, and ensure that each nation can rise to its own heroic potential." This historical invocation of Heracles underscores how the myth has been adapted to frame large-scale social projects, reinforcing the idea that heroic narratives can serve as ethical scaffolding for collective endeavors. When we bring these historical and contemporary strands together, a pattern emerges. The Heraclean archetype functions as a flexible moral template that can be stretched to accommodate both individual excellence and collective responsibility. It offers a language for articulating the magnitude of modern challenges, whether they be ecological, technological, or social, while also providing a narrative of hope that emphasizes agency. Yet the hero's story also warns of hubris. In the ancient tragedy, Heracles' final labor ends in tragedy. His death is precipitated by a poisoned cloak sent by his wife Deianira, a reminder that even the mightiest can be undone by unintended consequences. This cautionary note resonates today when we consider the unintended side effects of technological interventions. For example, the rapid deployment of autonomous drones for wildfire monitoring has, in some cases, disrupted local wildlife patterns, illustrating how a well-intentioned, heroic tool can generate new, unforeseen problems, much like the Hydra's regenerative heads. To navigate this tension, contemporary virtue ethicists propose a model of heroic humility. This concept, articulated by contemporary philosopher Julia Driver, suggests that the hero's virtue lies not in domination, but in the willingness to acknowledge one's limits, to seek counsel, and to share the burden. Driver writes, a heroic life is lived in partnership, where strength is measured by the capacity to listen as much as to act. This redefinition aligns with Camus' absurd hero, who persists not because he expects a rational reward, but because he affirms his freedom in the face of an indifferent world. Camus writes in The Myth of Sisyphus, one must imagine Sisyphus happy, for the struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. The modern Heracles, therefore, may find fulfillment not in the completion of a single labor, but in the ongoing process of confronting challenges, learning from failure, and inviting others to join the effort. In practice, this philosophy can be seen in the work of community-based climate initiatives that adopt a shared labor model. In the city of Freiburg, Germany, a citizen-led program called Stables of the Future organizes neighborhood clean-ups, renewable energy cooperatives, and urban gardening projects. Participants describe their involvement as collective heroism, emphasizing that each small action, planting a tree, installing a solar panel, or simply reducing personal waste, contributes to a larger moral narrative. The program's founder, Lucas Müller, often cites the ancient myth in his speeches: "We do not need a single Heracles, we need many hands to pull the water from the stables." This sentiment reflects a pragmatic ethic that values cumulative impact over singular spectacle. The dialogue between heroic narratives and pragmatic ethics also informs policy debates on AI regulation. In 2024, the European Union's AI Act incorporated a principle of human-in-the-loop decision-making, mandating that high-risk AI systems retain human oversight. This legislative approach can be interpreted as an institutional iolaus, a safeguard designed to prevent the unchecked regeneration of the Hydra's heads. Critics, however, argue that the regulation is too modest, calling it a band-aid that fails to address the systemic nature of AI's challenges. A philosopher-activist, Dr. Leila Sanchez, responded in a public essay, "We must move beyond the illusion of a single hero who can tame the AI Hydra. We need a network of vigilant guardians, each trained to recognize and cauterize a new head as it appears." Her call for distributed responsibility underscores the shift from heroic individualism to collective stewardship. In reflecting upon these varied examples, it becomes clear that the ancient myth of Heracles continues to provide a rich repository of symbols for navigating contemporary ethical terrain. The image of the Augean stables invites us to confront systemic ecological decay with both technical ingenuity and moral resolve. The Hydra warns us of the perils of unchecked technological proliferation, urging a collaborative cauterization of emergent risks. The marathon runner exemplifies disciplined self-overcoming that can inspire broader societal commitment to health and perseverance. The whistleblower illustrates the courage to expose hidden corruption, reminding us that heroism sometimes entails personal sacrifice for the greater good. Artistic reinterpretations, from Kapoor's reflective sculpture to community murals, translate these ancient motifs into visual languages that engage the public imagination. Historical anecdotes, from the Panama Canal engineers to the post-war ILO, show that societies have long invoked Heraclean imagery to frame massive collective projects, highlighting both the motivational power and the potential for myth to obscure the contributions of many. Yet the counterarguments remind us that hero narratives can be double-edged. The nihilist perspective cautions against over-romanticizing human agency in a universe that may be indifferent to our struggles. The pragmatic ethicist warns that an over-reliance on singular heroism can undermine the development of robust, democratic institutions that distribute responsibility. Both critiques are valuable, for they prevent the myth from becoming a hollow slogan and encourage us to embed heroic ideals within a framework of humility, collaboration, and systemic awareness. In integrating these insights, we arrive at a nuanced conception of the modern hero, one that honors the ancient Heracles spirit of courageous action while grounding it in the relational ethics of contemporary virtue theory. This modern hero does not stand alone on a mountaintop, brandishing a club, but rather walks among us, sharing tools, listening to dissent, and recognizing that each labor is part of an ongoing chain. As Camus reminds us, the absurd hero persists not because he believes in a final triumph, but because he chooses to engage fully with the struggle itself. As Frankl teaches, meaning emerges when we commit to purposeful action, even when the outcome remains uncertain. As Aristotle suggests, virtue is cultivated through habit, not through isolated feats. And as the ancient poet Pindar writes, the hero's heart is a furnace that refuses to be quenched. It burns brighter when it shares its heat. Thus, when we look at climate activists cleaning rivers, technologists designing safeguards for AI, athletes pacing themselves through endless miles, or whistleblowers exposing hidden truths, we can see in each a fragment of Heracles' legacy, a willingness to confront the impossible, to endure suffering, and to transform personal labor into collective benefit. The contemporary resonances of Heracles invite us to ask, what labors do we each face in our own lives? How can we, like Heracles, balance strength with wisdom, courage with humility, and individual resolve with communal responsibility? In answering these questions, we not only honor an ancient myth, but also forge a path toward a more ethical, meaningful, and heroic future, one labor at a time.